Stop me if you've heard any of this before. Springtrap is just Huntress with xenomorph tunnels. Dracula is just Spirit and Pyramid Head and Wesker all mixed together. Kaneki is just a twink son of Wesker and Blight who was abandoned in Ormond Lake Mine and wound up being raised by the Legion. Okay, maybe not the exact words of the last one, but it's hard to deny that one of the DBD community's favourite hobbies is comparing new killer powers to existing ones with the intention of coming across as derivative, implying that behaviour is running out of ideas. And you know me, I am the first one in line to criticise when too many killers are following too closely to one particular archetype. Not naming any names, of course. Dashlock! But as much as I'll talk your ear off any day of the week about how DBD needs a level of diverse power design it's just not getting, that's really not what this video is about. At least not for most of the video, because today we'll be looking at a key feature in DBD's design evolution over the years that I think is both not talked about enough and direly misunderstood when it is brought up. And it's an issue that affects many games but is only just starting to make its mark on Dead by Daylight. Power creep. Today we'll be taking a look at DBD's history of power creep mostly through the lens of killer power designs, trying to understand why and how so many games fall victim to it, why it took so long for it to start causing problems in DBD, and the good and bad sides of power creep with regards to killer powers. Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers, to the evolution of Dead by Daylight's design philosophy, and the role power creep has been playing in it. Before we get stuck in, it's probably a good idea to figure out what the hell power creep actually is. It is a well-documented phenomenon in all sorts of games with regular release models like card games or multiplayer online games. The general principle is that newer releases are made to be more powerful than older releases, with the typical implication being that it's a marketing thing, to ensure that people with the old stuff still buy the newer stuff. It's worth noting something doesn't have to be a strict improvement over the older thing for it to qualify as power creep. Take a look at Magic the Gathering, for example. Quick Study is strictly better than Divination because they have the same rules text, draw 2 cards. But Quick Study is an instant, meaning it can be cast on an opponent's turn, but Divination is a sorcery, so it can only be cast on your own turn. That flexibility has no downside, meaning that Quick Study is a strictly better, power-crept version of Divination. Easy and simple. Now let's compare Stock Up to Quick Study. Stock Up is a sorcery, so it can only be cast on your turn, like Divination. But rather than just giving you a random card from the top 2, it gives you an element of choice by picking the best 2 of the top 5 cards and putting the worst 3 on the bottom of your deck where you're not going to draw them. Stock Up is a power-crept version of Quick Study. It's not always better, but it's stronger enough, often enough, to be overall much, much better. There's a reason you can get Quick Study for pennies, but Stock Up is 12 quid. It's not strictly better, but it's definitely power-crept. I think a similar parallel can be seen between the newest killer, Springtrap, and Huntress, one of DBD's oldest and most popular killers. Both Springtrap and Huntress are conceptually similar in chase. Both characters move at 110 speed and wind up and throw axes at the survivors, instantly taking your health state with each axe hit. But Springtrap has a bunch of nuance and extra stuff in his kit that Huntress just doesn't have. He has a security door system, giving him instant on-demand map coverage. He moves at 115% speed at any time he doesn't have an axe ready to throw, something Huntress has to have an iridescent add-on for. He has a jump scare grab, allowing him to ignore blinds when it works. His axe gives him tracking when it's stuck in somebody or something. He doesn't have to reload his axes at lockers, and he doesn't have a lullaby acting like a giant pre-running alarm so the survivors can get out of dodge ASAP. To her credit, Huntress definitely has her own set of strengths too. Huntress is an incredible camper and hook trader, and while Springtrap definitely can do these things, he's not as good at her as doing it, due to his 7-second cooldown after getting his axe back. Her hatchets fly straighter than Springtrap's fire axe, so it gives her a longer effective range. She can zone more effectively due to that straighter flight path. She doesn't give the survivors surveillance and map traversal through the security door and camera system, and 7 hatchets means she can afford to miss in a lot of situations where Springtrap just can't. If Springtrap misses, he has to amble around as M1 Cyborg Pizza Zombie Man for several seconds until he can recall it. But Huntress can just wind up and try again. But in aggregate, it's hard to argue that Springtrap's benefits don't broadly outweigh Huntress's. He just has a lot of options that she doesn't have in exchange for some lost efficiency in some situations like camping and zoning. Hell, the same heavier hatchet that makes Springtrap zoning more conditional can make it a lot more lethal in the right hands, because it makes his orbitals and arc shots a lot more consistent than Huntress is in some tiles. It's power creep in action. But is that inherently a bad thing? It's not like Huntress was a bad killer by any means. She was considered genuinely super strong in the game's very early days, and she's still considered at least solid today. So you might then be wondering why a killer who's been pretty decent for the game's entire lifespan just got a massively power crept version of herself added 8 years after her release. The obvious and cynical answer is that Behaviour wanted to sell the FNAF DLC to as many players as possible. Huntress is a free killer and she's old as balls, so a lot of the people who would spend money on some of her 1,000 million skins already have done so. But Springtrap is the brand new shiny toy, who's attached to one of the most hyped licenses Behaviour has ever acquired. If they nailed the power, they'd make enough money to keep Dave Richard in quirky novelty glasses for the rest of his life. But there's more to it than that. A less cynical explanation that makes sense when you realise the ways in which Huntress is more powerful than Springtrap. Huntress's strengths tend to come in areas that create gameplay frustrations for the survivors, and cause the game's pace to warp around her. For example, camping. Huntress can camp hooked survivors very effectively. She can throw a hatchet at somebody while they're unhooking, cancel the animation after they get hit, and do it again to down them, either forcing an instant hook trade and allowing her to tunnel the person right off hook with more hatchets, or cancel the unhook completely if she has the right add-ons to help her do it. And she can do this from a far enough distance to avoid the base kit anti-camping mechanic for the most part. Springtrap can't easily do this. He's only got one shot, so make it count. And it has a limited effective range due to its weight. If he wants to secure a hook trade, he has to do it from closer up, which gives the survivor a chance to unhook themselves with the anti-camp feature. Huntress is also exceptional at mid-range zoning with her hatchets. As soon as she gets LOS on the survivor, she can invoke the spirit of holding Harry and just walk you down with a hatchet held up. If you don't strafe, you're clobbered by a hatchet because you're moving predictably, but if you do strafe and try and dodge it, all she has to do is keep walking at you with the hatchet held up, you'll lose distance and she'll catch up for the M1 hit, or a point-blank hatchet. Springtrap has got an effective range cap due to his weighted axe, and so while he can do this, the range at which he can do so is more prohibitive, more in the vein of Deathslinger. This gives the survivor more time to path to an LOS breaker. He can hold alright, but the council does not grant him the rank of Harry. Both of these situations where Huntress excels over Springtrap involve very little survivor agency or decision making, creating no-win scenarios where you either leave the survivor on hook to die, or probably die yourself saving them with little effort from the Huntress and not a lot to really show for it. Or, if you'd rather, areas where you die because you either strafe or didn't strafe. Springtrap giving survivors more options in these situations gave room for his power to be expressed in other areas, through the doors and the extra speed and the stealth and what have you, and because these things have more points of interaction, they can be stronger without disrupting the normal gameplay flow. Springtrap power creeps Huntress by improving on her design. It's less oppressive in her more frustrating areas, but so much stronger in other areas, that it doesn't matter and results in a stronger killer overall. This is an example of beneficial power creep, where redistributing where power is in a character's kit allows them to be made stronger than their predecessors were without disrupting the standard gameplay loop of Dead by Daylight too heavily. It can definitely be a tool to drive sales, but it also serves a valuable game design function, as Behaviour broadly gets better at designing killer powers with a healthy distribution of strength. A similar upgrade can be seen between Myers and Oni, two killers who start off the game as weak basic M1s but upgrade themselves into instant downing killing machines. Myers' stealth gameplay and extremely limited skill expression has kept him as a pretty crappy killer for most of his existence. But when designing Oni, Behaviour learned from the mistakes Myers made. His power was more broadly useful, skill expressive and lethal, with a lot more depth to him than Michael that is reflected by the massive gap in power between the two killers. It's not just power creep here, it's health creep. Health creep can let developers make updated versions of older character archetypes without changing the existing character around too much and alienating their players. If you're going to keep reiterating on the same designs over and over again, in my opinion, this is how it should be done. Health creep can yield great results, like Springtrap iterating on Huntress, Oni iterating on Myers, and Pinhead iterating on Clown and Nurse, which is a wild pair of killers to be putting together for this guy. And this happens so much because a lot of DBD's older killer designs have deep-set foundational limitations and issues and problems at a fundamental level, and it took a long time for Behaviour to learn what does or does not make a good killer power. It took years for them to really get their shit together, meaning that we have a backlog of killers ripe for future health creep. There were some early successes that wound up aging very well, like Doctor, Wraith, and arguably Hillbilly, But for most of DBD's history, Behaviour made lots of shitty killers because they didn't know how to make good ones, or made horrifically stupid killers because they didn't understand what was or was not fair as a level of interaction to expect for players. If your name is Legion, you get the unique honour of being both these things at once. This means that basically every killer released before Plague was ripe to get health crept once Behaviour knew what they were doing. And this generally good track record of killers that we've had since about Plague or Oni has come as a result of continuous health creep catching up to older and more flawed designs. But not every instance of power creep is quite so benevolent, especially recently. A lot of the time, power creep in killer design comes as a result of giving players more of what they want instead of what they need, and they wind up expanding what the killer can do in a way that causes problems, or trying to fix what isn't broken and start to create more problems than they solve. And there is no killer who emphasises this harmful approach to power creep quite like Albert Wesker. Not Wesker himself, mind you. Nah, Wesker's actual power is pretty cool, one of the best dash killer designs in my opinion, and in many ways he represents a de-escalation of power compared to the killers that preceded him in that category. Blight was his immediate predecessor in the dash killer archetype, and even at his strongest, Wesker was no Blight. But to many people he was a lot more fun for it, and his gigantic pick rate is a testament to that success. A success that would come back to bite him right on his eugenesis backside. Throughout DBD's 9th year, Wesker got the unique honour of being clearly and obviously power crept by 3 consecutive new killers. First Dracula in September, then Houndmaster in December, and then finally Kaneki in March. I can see why they wanted to do this. Wesker was insanely well liked, so more killers that fit into his archetype were almost guaranteed to follow and be powerful and successful. And on his release, Wesker had a particular problem that Behaviour probably thought they could health creep out of that archetype: the infection system. Ouroboros infection was a good idea on paper, as it provided a source of game delay to offset Wesker's relative lack of map coverage, and reasonably fair expected chase times, but on release it made him far too effective at tunnelling. It did get nerfed pretty substantially, but the nerf it got meant that Wesker has now fully recovered in terms of strength, even though they tried to compensate him. He went from being a comfortable mid or even high A tier to skirting the A to B tier borderline from update to update. By making a health crept version of Wesker, Behaviour had the opportunity to make a massively powerful and popular killer to play against. But despite 3 attempts to do so, they never quite succeeded. Let's start with the most obvious contender, possibly the living incarnation of power creep himself, Dracula, who has such a strong and versatile kit, he's somehow managed to power creep half the bloody roster at this point. You want to play Spirit? Just play Dracula, he does her job, but better. You want to play a mid-range donor like Pyramid Head or Nemesis? Just play Dracula, he does their job, but better. You want to play a dash killer like Wesker or Chucky? Just play Dracula, he does their job, but better. You want to play an M1 killer like Cenobite or Skull Merchant? I've seen the pick rates. No, you fucking don't. Dracula kind of does everything you might want a killer to do, and his power is expressed in lots of different ways as a result. But the most obvious source of power creep is wolf form, which I can only describe as Wesker with fewer steps. Each pounce dash at a 6 meter range, compared to Wesker's dashes which have about 9 meters of range each with the Unicorn Medallion, but wolf form has a much faster, less punishing and less telegraphed wind-up, gets sporadic haste orbs that stack with Bloodlust, give tracking and reduce the attack cooldown below Wesker's cooldown, has a third-person camera with the short camera angle so he can chuck spot, and he doesn't need to slam you into a wall to get a health state. Wolf form has so much stuff stuffed into it to make up for the lack of the infection. It's Wesker's bound with fewer steps and it's only one of Drax's 3 powers. The end result creates a killer who is rampantly overloaded. He's widely considered to be a top 6 or top 8 killer, depending on who's making the tier list, just because wolf form is one of the strongest dash powers in the game, on top of 2 other whole entire killer powers that he gets to use. And that brings us to Houndmaster, the middle child of the dash slop era and in my opinion the most underrated of the 3. If Dracula is functionally similar to Wesker because his dashes are used in similar ways to Wesker's Unicorn Medallion add-on, Houndmaster is mechanically similar to Wesker, because even though Snug's role in her kit is more like a projectile than a conventional dash killer, the way that Snug collides with and slides off terrain uses the exact same pathfinding rules as Wesker's dashes, except Snug is huggier of course. Houndmaster got a higher skill floor than Wesker, but she's significantly stronger even after the nerfs to Snug's Vault Speed in the recent mid-chapter. And while I'd argue she has some improvements over Wesker, such as her map mobility and Snug's hugginess allowing for more creative plays, that strength doesn't always manifest in healthy ways. She's an incredible zoner, which can severely limit the survivor's options in chase, and her camping is absolutely exceptional, which can make unhooked situations a little hairy. Some things never change.
You just said each member of the team is chosen for their unique abilities. He does exactly what I do.
But better.
I always hit my targets dead center.
I hit them more in the center.
If she was being compared to the CEO of tunneling himself, Release Wesker, there might be an argument for a health side grade here. But Houndmaster absolutely has a more destructive effect on gameplay than Wesker does now, even if she's not quite as bad for it as Dracula is. And last but most definitely not least, we have John Ghoul himself, Ken Kaneki. What do we need to say about Kaneki that hasn't already been said? He released extremely powerful, extremely easy, and extremely popular as a result of both these things, and that created a perfect storm of dash slop that was in all respects just kinda better than Wesker. He got his first health state by vaguely implying you were in the area, his dashes are fast and available enough that he actually has incredible map mobility on the level of Billy or Blight, something that Wesker doesn't have, and while Wesker's in-tile zoning was more effective in theory, Kaneki has way better distance denial zoning, and that only applies to the second health state anyway. Wesker players, the length and breadth of the game, made their jump to Kaneki, and even though that process seems to have slowed down after he got heavily nerfed, Kaneki still has Wesker's crown as his popular killer in Dead by Daylight, and it's really not hard to see why. If you want a killer who chains 2 or more dashes together to catch survivors out mid-chase, the only reason you would play Wesker over Kaneki is if you're a big Resident Evil fan, if you like the throw and slam system enough that you'll take making your own life harder to play around with it, or if you want the survivors in your lobby to not call you a slur in the post-game. Wesker, one of DBD's most popular killers and widely considered one of its healthiest killers ever, has spent the past 9 months being effectively invalidated in terms of strength over and over. And this creates a difficult challenge going forwards, because it's not inherently a bad thing for a killer to be strong. Houndmaster being a bit stronger than Wesker I think is acceptable, given that she's also harder to play than him, you work harder for better results, and while I think all 3 of these guys could do with some tuning, it's not like they're Blight or Nurse either. And we've seen what happens after Wesker's infection system is buffed up to the point that he does contend with the mid to high A tiers we see here. He becomes an incredible tunneler and creates all kinds of nasty gameplay issues along the way. It's the downside of power creep played out in real time. There's mostly no reason to play Wesker anymore, but we can't really buff Wesker to address this, at least not to the level of the killers that power crept him. And we really don't need to sledgehammer the new Weskers down to his level either. And even if we could buff Wesker to that level without making him horribly unhealthy like he used to be, it wouldn't solve the power creep problem because it extends so far beyond just Wesker. It would be like trying to save $1 trillion a year in the federal budget by cutting small-scale government programs instead of slashing corporate welfare and defense spending. A truly terrifying thought, but thank God nobody's on enough ketamine to try that one. Artis has been power crept heavily by the increase in mobility characters making her indirect map pressure less relevant, while meta changes to the perks that she used to synergize incredibly well with have also made her strength less pronounced than it used to be. Demogorgon is the archetypical mid-range zoner that gave birth to an entire genre of killers that have all gone on to make him irrelevant. Unknown is in power crept by Springtrap in a similar way to Huntress, despite barely being a year old. Vecna is a multi-powered killer who got power crept by the very next killer that came out right after him. Singularity has power crept every single pre-existing setup killer in the game. And this might be a bit of a hot take, but he kind of power crept Deathslinger as well. Slinger is a killer who deals damage with M1s while removing survivor distance with his reeling as he can shoot over resources. He's 110, he has no map pressure, he's dependent on precise aim, and he has to reload after every single shot. Singularity has all these strengths without the difficult aim requirement, with good map control from the biopods, and with the ability to demolish map resources effortlessly. And he's 115 to boot, if not faster. Even not using your power at all has been power crap, because Chucky's tiny size and third-person camera means he's better at not using his power than anybody else in the roster. You could remove Slice and Dice completely, and Chucky would probably still be better than Skull Merchant. Treating power creep's effect on any one killer would just mean more power creep, more adding to the problem and invalidating older killers, and undoing the effects of DBD's power creep on the game as a whole would be a long and arduous process of rebalancing and redesigning half the roster of killers at this point, and that would be a very unpopular move. In part because reworking older or more niche killers risks obliterating identity completely and alienating their fans, not that that stopped behaviour from trying before, mind you, and in part because that would likely involve significant nerfs to very popular killers and perks that would elicit a similar response to the one a Tuxedo Ace might give when their key gets sack-warded and they lose to any killer released between Trapper and Springtrap. That's not even taking into account DBD's unique form of power creep, a problem that very few if any other games have to worry about. The arms race, created by asymmetrical power creep. In most multiplayer games, everyone has access to fundamentally the same tools. There might be individually unbalanced characters or abilities, but at least anybody can run them, which tends to prompt rapid nerfs because the game just becomes the same few characters every single game, driving players completely insane. But DBD has to worry about not just keeping each killer individually useful when compared to all the others, but also useful against the strongest things survivors can bring into a match. And if you think the survivor role is free of power creep in its own right, oh baby, you could not be more wrong. The most obvious example from recent history, in fact it's going on right now, is healing perks. Back in my day, we used to have a really oppressive healing meta back when Circle of Healing ruled the game completely. But after Circle's nerf, we assumed that era would be over. With the recent runs of changes over the past year or so, that may not be true anymore, but through the massive continuous buffing of old perks rather than the release of new game-breaking ones. For example, the buffed Resurgence has made resetting off hook virtually instant in a way that stacks with other healing perks. We've seen buffs in the past year to Resurgence, Autodidact, Botany Knowledge, Empathic Connection twice, Desperate Measures, Solidarity, and We're Gonna Live Forever, alongside a nerf to Mangled, and all these healing steroids stack with each other for the most part, meaning reset speeds are becoming incredibly fast in a way they haven't been since Michaela Reed ruined everyone's fun back in 2021. It's not new perks breaking the meta per se, it's poorly thought out buffs to old perks that are causing a gradual but unchecked escalation of power, and it's not really coming alongside nerfs to the strongest Survivor stuff either. The only recent Survivor stuff that's been nerfed lately has been perks that got over-buffed and then partially reverted, so they're overall still buffed, just a bit less buffed. Think Background Player, We're Gonna Live Forever, or Buckle Up. Most of the strongest stuff Survivors have had for years, like Exhaustion perks, anti-tunneling perks, and strong item add-ons, have been relatively untouched or even become stronger thanks to synergy perks like Shoulder the Burden, Duty of Care, and the recently buffed Blood Rush and Vigil. And that's on top of base kit Survivor buffs like Anti-Camp and longer hook stages. This is a lot of power that's been added to the Survivor role in the past year or so, and the average to weak killer has generally been struggling to keep up, especially with reductions to killer slowdown suites across the board without any particular new meta perks lining up to replace them. We've seen nerfs to Grim Embrace, Pain Res, Pentimento, and Pop, without new slowdowns being buffed up or created to contend with them. The closest newcomer we have may being Oppression, and I believe this is by design, because we've had all these strong killers lately. Behaviour seems to be okay, moving strength out of killer perks and into the new killer powers instead. And on one hand, this makes the new killers very appealing to play and relatively easy to balance around, because they can be designed without perk dependency in mind and tend to have lots of numbers that you can tweak to balance them properly. But the side effect here is that older killers, the kinds who tend to have simpler kits suited better to a different era of DBD, end up getting left behind. Imagine being Ghostface or Hag in 2025, watching Survivor healing speeds double in a year, while hook stages get longer, generators get faster, and behaviour turns up like, this Pop Goes the Weasel, you've been running for 5 years? Yeah, some guy who shits in a sock and hasn't been outside since COVID went on a 500 win streak with Dracula, using it so we're going to shoot it into the vacuum of space. But here's half an add-on base kit. Have fun guys, and don't forget to buy the Catboy anniversary skin on your way out. Pain Res or Grim Embrace weren't nerfed for Doctor or Ghostface or Trapper, they were nerfed for Dracula and Kaneki and Blight. The A and S tiers that already existed all got power crept into existence, and that to me is the true measure of the damage of power creep in Dead by Daylight. The new, more powerful killers are the benchmark of strength around which new Survivor and killer perks are balanced. But with every Botany Knowledge buff or Pain Resonance nerf, the gap between the weakest and strongest killers only gets bigger, because the killers who can teleport across the map and end a chase in seconds don't care about 5% off a pain res proc, but the C tier warriors do. This is the end result of DBD's escalating power creep, a massive division between the strongest and weakest killers, exacerbated by both the higher levels of power granted to newer killers alongside a reduction in the strength of perks the lower tiers depended on to survive. New releases for both Killer and Survivor are becoming stronger than ever, and while these new releases tend to be healthy for the game as a whole, it means that long-term players who might be invested in these existing killers are slowly being left behind. So what can we do about this? Or perhaps the question is, what should we do about this? We've talked before about how power creep can result in positive innovation in killer power designs, so the solution isn't to avoid power creep altogether. But perhaps a good approach going forward might be, if it ain't broke, you don't need to fix it. If you've already made Wesker a very successful killer design that might only need some relatively minor adjustments to be the healthiest he can be, there might not be a need to make 3 more of him in a 1-year period, all of which are better than him. Maybe you don't need to make a killer with 3 great powers right after you just made a killer with 4 mediocre ones. Health creep should be more important than raw power creep. Maybe this results in more mid-size adjustments and reworks for killers that need them. Maybe this means that more killers should be focused around modernising old archetypes and giving them a new coat of paint. More trap killers, more stealth killers. I'd like to see more iterations on unique designs like Knight, Clown, Cenobite, Plague, Ghostface or Oni someday. Let these guys get health creeped, it could be really fun. Behaviour also needs to take more care considering the implications of number buffing perks they consider underused or undertuned. Prime example is Botany Knowledge. Botany was already a really good perk, so buffing it in a patch alongside a million other healing perk buffs, after a year of a million other healing perk buffs, is pointless power creep that disproportionately affects the weaker killers. They struggle more to get health states, so Botany undoing that work faster and more efficiently, bricking their time management, matters a lot more. It's worth noting that in Dead by Daylight, power creep is at its most devastating at high-level non-organised play, where there are no restrictions on what players can bring, and players are more inclined to be able to use the tools in their arsenal to the fullest. Power creep is very common in competitive games, where playing with a more powerful character, item, or card is a driving force behind consistent tournament turnouts. When the strongest cards from a decade ago are still the strongest cards today, the metagame starts to stagnate. But Dead by Daylight's not competitive, at least until it is, so driving competitive turnout is not a reason for power creep like it is in many other games. If anything, power creep is seeing competitive DBD set on fire, because a lot of power creep perks or mechanics wind up getting banned out altogether. But in high-level public gameplay, there's no bans or restrictions on what players can bring, and that's where power creep is at its most destructive. If behaviour is serious about bringing power level discrepancies under control, that's where they need to be focusing. Players at the high MMR soft cap are most likely to be able to use the tools they have to the fullest, so the meta is more firmly defined there, and power creep is more likely to exclude certain killers from being able to get decent results. And this frightens me, because behaviour has been catering more and more to new players, meaning this power creep at higher levels of play has been running rampant for a while behaviour has only been making it worse. To be fair, I understand why. FNAF's arrival is a massive catalyst of new player arrivals, and it does make sense to want to cater to them in the run-up by making a bunch of powerful and accessible killers and perks. But we've got to make sure that when we get back to business, and the incoming newbies become longer-term invested players, that all the years behaviour and players have spent trying to get this game into a healthy and balanced state aren't burned to ash, lying dead under a pile of sadness and Yamori's masks.